Most flights are forgettable. You board, you take off, you land, and a week later, you barely remember the seat you sat in. But sometimes a phone, a dash cam, or a security camera is already recording when everything goes wrong. A normal flight turns into a fight for survival, and the whole thing is preserved in a few seconds of horrifying video. In this documentary, we will look at real aviation moments that were filmed in their final or most terrifying seconds. And we will match those images with what investigators later discovered about the crews, the weather, and the systems that failed. Before we begin, if you want more real crash stories told calmly and in detail, you can support this work by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps more than you think, and it tells me to keep making documentaries like this. TransAsia Airways Flight 235 was supposed to be a short, routine hop. On February 4, 2015, an ATR-72 left Taipei Songshan Airport for Kinmen with 58 people on board. It was late morning. The weather over the city was calm, with light cloud and good visibility. Nothing in the sky suggested what was about to happen. From the start, the flight followed a standard pattern. The pilots pushed the power levers forward, and the aircraft began to accelerate. It lifted off, climbed away over the buildings of Taipei, and turned toward the river that runs through the city. Down below, traffic was moving across a raised highway bridge over the Keelung River. Several drivers had dash cams running, capturing an ordinary day. About 40 seconds after takeoff, things inside the cockpit changed. A warning sounded, and one of the engines began to lose power automatically. The system that manages power on takeoff sensed a problem on the right engine and partly shut it down to protect the aircraft. The airplane was still flying, and it still had one engine working normally. The correct response in this situation is clear and very specific. The crew must carefully identify which engine has failed, keep power on the good engine, and follow a step-by-step checklist. Instead, in a moment of confusion, the pilots made a different choice. They reduced power on the left engine, the one that was still healthy, and then moved its throttle all the way back. In effect, they shut down their only working engine while the other one was already at low power. The ATR-72 kept climbing for a short time, reaching an altitude of about 1,600 feet. Then, the climb stopped. With almost no effective thrust left, the speed began to fall. A stall warning sounded, a loud alarm that tells the crew the wings are about to stop producing enough lift. Instead of lowering the nose to reduce the angle of attack and regain speed, the pilots kept trying to pull the airplane up, hoping to hold the climb. They also tried to restart the engine they had just shut down, but every second they spent high nose and low speed made the stall worse. The aircraft rolled and yawed as the air over the wings broke down. From the ground, drivers on the highway saw something they would never forget. The ATR-72 came into view low over the river, wings level at first, then suddenly rolling left. In one dashcam clip, the airplane fills the frame, banked almost 90 degrees, left wing pointing down toward the road. It is so close that you can see the propellers and the airline's colors on the tail. A moment later, the left wingtip struck the front of a taxi on the bridge and then hit the concrete side of the viaduct. The outer part of the wing broke away, throwing debris and pieces of the guardrail across the road. The aircraft, now missing part of its wing and fully stalled, continued to roll and dropped into the river below. The ATR hit the water upside down and broke into large sections. The front part of the fuselage and cockpit took the worst of the impact. The rear section, where some of the passengers were seated, stayed partly intact and floated with part of the cabin above the surface. Cold river water rushed in through broken windows and gaps in the structure. People living nearby and drivers on the bridge called emergency services within seconds. Rescue boats, firefighters, and military units arrived quickly and began working along the riverbank. Rescuers climbed onto the wreckage, cut belts, pulled people out of the tilted cabin, and ferried them to shore in inflatable boats. Divers went into the murky water to reach those trapped in the submerged part of the fuselage. Out of the 58 people on board, 15 survived. Most of the survivors were in the rear part of the cabin, where some seats and floor sections stayed intact long enough for them to escape. The others, especially those in the front and near the wing, did not make it. On the ground, the taxi driver and passenger both suffered injuries when the wing sliced across the bridge. The investigation later confirmed the chain of errors that turned a single engine problem into a full loss of control. The right engine suffered a fault and reduced power automatically, but it did not fail in a violent way. The crew did not follow the standard engine failure procedure, did not clearly cross-check which side had the problem, and shut down the left engine, which was still producing full thrust. With both engines effectively lost and the nose held too high, the airplane stalled at low altitude. The pilots did not apply the correct stall recovery technique in time, and there simply was not enough height left to recover. Investigators also found deeper issues behind that moment in the cockpit. The captain had previously struggled with engine failure scenarios in simulator checks. The airline's training and manuals did not give enough clear guidance on how to handle the specific combination of warnings that occurred. In other words, the mistake in the air did not come from nowhere. It grew out of gaps in practice and preparation on the ground. For most people around the world, TransAsia Flight 235 is remembered as the bridge video. For pilots and investigators, it is a hard lesson in how quickly confusion, misdiagnosis, and a wrong movement of one hand on the throttle can turn a normal climb into a fatal stall, even just a couple of minutes after takeoff. Jeju Air Flight 2216 was supposed to be the end of a holiday. On 29 December 2024, a Boeing 737 left Bangkok in the middle of the night, heading for Muan International Airport in South Korea, with 181 people on board, 175 passengers, and 6 crew. It was a popular leisure route. Many people were coming home from trips to Thailand, tired and ready to land, not expecting anything more dramatic than a winter morning at a small regional airport. The flight toward Korea was uneventful. As dawn approached, visibility around Muan was good. There was no fog, no strong wind. On the surface, it looked like a simple arrival. But one detail mattered a lot. Muan is known for bird activity. In recent years, it had recorded more bird strikes than any other regional airport in the country. At 8:54 in the morning, air traffic control cleared Jeju flight to land on runway. As the jet lined up on final, the tower warned the crew about birds near the approach path. A short time later, the pilots themselves reported seeing a flock below them. Then something went wrong very quickly. The cockpit voice and data recorders stopped at 8:58. 6 seconds later, the crew declared Mayday and began a go-around. They told the tower they could not land and needed to try again. One of the working theories, based on early evidence, is that a bird strike hit the right engine and caused a problem with the systems that control the landing gear and possibly power. What is known is that the pilots were soon in a difficult situation. They were trying to get the airplane back on the ground with a reported landing gear problem and at least one engine affected. They requested to land in the opposite direction, on runway 19. Likely because it gave them a more suitable wind and approach profile for an emergency landing. The tower agreed. One restaurant owner on a rooftop began filming with his phone when he saw the jet approaching low and fast in an unusual attitude. His 54-second clip would later be seen all over the world. At 9:03, Jeju Air Flight came into view over the runway with its landing gear still up. In the video, the airplane appears nose-high, descending without wheels, its engine nacelles hanging close to the asphalt. As it touches down about 1,200 meters along the runway, a shower of sparks bursts from underneath as metal scrapes along concrete. The 737 slides on its belly with the nose still slightly raised. For a few seconds, the jet remains largely intact, skidding along the runway in a plume of smoke and sparks. If there had been nothing solid at the far end, it might have come to a violent but survivable stop. Instead, just beyond the runway's end, lies a raised earth berm holding a solid concrete structure, the antenna array for the instrument landing system's localizer. It is not a frangible fence or soft ground. It is a hard wall. In the phone video, you see the airplane sliding off the end of the runway and disappearing behind the berm. A split second later, the screen fills with orange and black. The engines smash into the concrete and earth and are driven deep into the structure. The front of the fuselage breaks open and tears apart. The tail, still moving, pitches over and comes to rest inverted on the far side of the berm. Fuel spilling from the torn wings ignites in an enormous fireball that climbs into the sky, sending thick black smoke up over the flat landscape. Inside the cabin, there is no time for an orderly evacuation. The forces of the impact throw passengers forward. Seats break, overhead bins collapse, and heavy objects fly through the cabin. The belly landing and first slide would already have injured many people. The final collision with the berm is catastrophic. Almost instantly, fire and toxic smoke pour into the fuselage, especially in the front and middle sections. Emergency services receive their first calls around 9:03. Firefighters, soldiers, and police rush to the scene, but the heat around most of the wreck is so intense that they cannot enter. They train hoses on the flames and attack the fire from multiple angles. It takes more than half an hour to fully extinguish the blaze. When rescuers finally reach the wreckage, they find that almost everyone has died where they sat. Only 2 people survive. The 2 flight attendants who had been strapped into the aft jump seats in the tail section. That part of the airplane, though inverted and crushed, remained just intact enough to shield them from the worst of the fire. Rescuers use hydraulic tools to free one of them, pinned under a cabinet. and pull both out alive. They are seriously injured and disoriented. Neither can clearly remember the moments after the belly landing. In total, 179 of the 181 occupants lose their lives. It becomes the deadliest civil aviation accident in South Korea's history. The government declares a national period of mourning. Families gather in a hangar at Muan, converted into a temporary morgue. Memorial altars go up in cities across the country. News channels replay the same short videos again and again. The belly first landing, the long trail of sparks, the sudden bloom of fire when the airplane hits the berm. Investigators recover both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. One is damaged, but enough information remains to reconstruct the final minutes. Early statements from the accident board confirm a bird strike and a belly landing with the gear still up. They also point to the fixed concrete structure in the overrun area as a key factor in the scale of the disaster, something that critics say should never have been built so close to the end of a runway. The exact chain of technical events and cockpit decisions is still being studied, and the final report has not yet been released. For now, Jeju Air Flight sits at the uneasy edge between what we know and what we are still trying to understand. For viewers, it is one of the most disturbing clips in modern aviation. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was a long-haul flight near the end of a quiet ocean crossing. On July 6, 2013, a Boeing 777 left Seoul for San Francisco, with 307 people on board, 291 passengers, and 16 crew members. After more than 10 hours over the Pacific, the hardest part of the flight should have been behind them. The weather over San Francisco Bay was sunny, visibility was good, and the crew were cleared to land on runway 28 left. On that day, the usual landing aid for that runway, the vertical beam of the instrument landing system that shows the correct descent angle, was turned off for maintenance. Pilots knew this in advance from notices. It meant they would make a visual approach, using their eyes, the basic flight instruments, and a row of red and white lights beside the runway that show whether an airplane is high or low on the ideal path. At first, the approach looked normal on paper. Air traffic control asked them to keep their speed up while they followed other traffic toward the airport. As they came closer, the controllers cleared them to land and left the final part of the descent largely in the hands of the pilots and the airplane's automatic systems. Inside the cockpit, though, the situation was more complex. The captain was in training for his first landing in San Francisco on the Boeing 777, and another experienced captain was sitting in the right seat acting as his instructor. They were tired after a long flight and were dealing with a mix of automation modes they did not fully understand. About 1 minute and 20 seconds before impact, at an altitude of roughly 1,600 feet, the crew turned off the main autopilot and began to fly by hand. The thrust levers were already at idle. The pilots believed that an automatic speed control would keep the jet close to its target approach speed, but the system they were relying on was not active in the way they thought. From that moment on, there was nothing but their own attention to stop the speed from bleeding away. The airplane started to sink below the ideal descent path. The red and white lights beside the runway, which should show 2 red and 2 white, when the aircraft is on the right glide slope, shifted toward more red, a warning that they were low. At the same time, the airspeed slipped down knot by knot. The target speed for the approach was about 137 knots. In the last half minute, the real speed fell more than 30 knots below that. Passengers seated by the windows began to notice something was wrong. The water of the bay seemed very close. In the cockpit, the instructor captain called for more speed. The thrust levers were pushed forward. But this happened very late. The engines on a large jet take several seconds to spool up from idle to full power. They did not have those seconds to spare. 4 seconds before impact, a device called a stick shaker activated on the control columns. It vibrated the yokes and warned that the wings were on the edge of a stall. The captain pulled back, trying to hold the nose up. The co-pilot called for a go-around, the standard escape maneuver, when the airplane was already almost at the threshold of the runway. It was too late. At 11:28 a.m., the main landing gear and then the tail of the Boeing 777 struck the concrete seawall at the edge of the airport. The impact tore off the tail, ripped away the landing gear and ripped open the underside of the fuselage. The left engine separated from the wing. The rest of the airplane pitched and rolled, then slid, twisted, and broke apart along the runway in a spray of dust, debris, and sparks. Airport security cameras and news footage later showed the jet cartwheeling in a cloud of dirt, and then coming to rest in a broken, smoking shape beside the runway. Inside the cabin, the violence of the crash was extreme. Seats in the rear rows were torn from the floor and thrown around. Several flight attendants in the back were still strapped into their jump seats when the tail broke off. They were ejected onto the runway while still in their seats and survived with serious injuries. Overhead, bins burst open and baggage and ceiling panels fell into the aisles. Passengers described the cabin filling with dust and the sound of screaming mixed with alarm chimes, yet the main fuselage did not disintegrate. When the wreckage slid to a stop, large sections of the cabin were still intact enough to offer escape routes. Some passengers began to stand up and open overhead bins, not realizing how serious the situation was. Others looked out and saw flames. The pilots initially told the cabin crew to wait before evacuating while they talked to the control tower. One flight attendant saw fire outside near row 10 and reported it. Only then did the cockpit give the order to begin evacuation. Crew members opened usable doors, pulled handles to deploy the slides, and shouted at passengers to leave their bags behind and get out. On the runway, firefighters arrived within minutes. They began spraying foam and water on the burning parts of the aircraft and helped guide injured survivors away from the wreckage. In total, 3 passengers died, 2 of them teenage students who were found outside the aircraft after being thrown from the rear during the crash, and a third who died days later in hospital. More than 180 other occupants were injured, 49 of them seriously. Out of 307 people on board, 304 survived. The investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the core cause was a poorly managed approach. The crew allowed the airplane to get too low and too slow, relied on an automatic speed mode that was not actually protecting them, and did not go around when the approach clearly fell outside safe limits. Contributing factors included confusing design of the automation, gaps in the airline's training, and the extra workload of doing a visual approach after a long flight into an unfamiliar airport. National Airlines Flight 102 was not a passenger flight. On April 29, 2013, a Boeing 747 cargo jet stood on the runway at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, preparing to carry military equipment to Dubai. There were only 7 people on board, all crew members. In the main deck behind them, instead of suitcases, there were 5 heavy armored vehicles tied down on pallets. Each one weighed as much as a small tank. This was the first time the airline had tried to carry 5 of these vehicles at once in this aircraft type. The procedures in the company's cargo manual were complex, and, as investigators later found, not fully correct. Some of the straps used were not strong enough for this kind of load. The way the vehicles were positioned and restrained did not follow the most conservative limits set by the aircraft manufacturer and the cargo system manufacturer. That afternoon, weather at Bagram was unsettled. There was a thunderstorm in the area, and the wind had been shifting in direction. Visibility, however, was good. The crew taxied out for departure from runway 03, the long strip of concrete pointing roughly toward the northeast. Near the end of the runway, a road ran almost in line with the climb-out path. On that road, a truck driver had a dashboard camera running, as many drivers now do. When the tower cleared them for takeoff, the pilots advanced the thrust levers. The 4 engines on the 747 built up power, and the huge jet began to accelerate down the runway. Everything looked and felt normal at first. The speed rose through the standard callouts. At rotation speed, the pilot flying eased back on the control column. The nose lifted, and the main wheels left the ground. Flight 102 was airborne. What happens next is known as much from the dashcam video as from the flight recorders. At only a few hundred feet above the runway, the nose of the airplane began to rise more steeply than normal. Instead of climbing at a modest angle, the 747 pitched up into a very high nose-up attitude. In the video, you can see the wings almost level, the nose pointing toward the sky, and the aircraft's ground speed dropping. Inside the cargo hold, something had gone terribly wrong. At least one of the heavy vehicles had broken free from its restraints. Under the great force of takeoff acceleration and the climb, it rolled backward toward the tail. When tens of tons of metal move even a short distance inside an airplane, the effect on balance is huge. The center of gravity shifted abruptly toward the rear. That alone would have made the nose want to pitch up. The loose vehicle did more than shift the balance. It crashed through the structure at the back of the cargo bay, striking the rear pressure bulkhead and the area where important control components are installed. In the process, it damaged 2 of the hydraulic systems and the mechanism that moves the horizontal stabilizer, including its main jack screw. The stabilizer is the small wing on the tail that helps control the pitch of the airplane. With that mechanism broken and jammed in a nose-up position, the pilots no longer had a normal way to push the nose down. On the dashcam video, the jet looks wrong even to an untrained eye. It is climbing far too steeply, almost like a fighter jet pulling up after a low pass. But this is a fully loaded 747. The climb slows, the nose keeps pointing up, and then the airplane begins to lose speed. Inside the cockpit, stall warnings would have sounded, and the pilots would have been pushing hard on the control columns, trying to force the nose down. With the center of gravity too far aft and the stabilizer damaged, their efforts had little effect. A few seconds later, the aircraft stalls. The wings can no longer produce enough lift at that extreme angle. The nose finally drops, but now it drops too far and too fast. In the video, the 747 seems to hang for a moment, then falls forward, transitions from nose high to nose down, and starts descending toward the ground at a shallow forward angle, but with a very steep nose-down attitude. The jet disappears behind a row of buildings, and then a massive fireball rises up from within the base perimeter. The crash site is just beyond the end of the runway. Impact forces and the explosion destroy the aircraft almost completely. All 7 crew members on board are died instantly. Remarkably, no one on the ground is hurt, even though the crash occurs near active ramps and parked vehicles. The investigation that followed had to answer 2 questions. Why did the cargo come loose? And why could the crew not recover? The recorders, which had been mounted in a rack near the back of the airplane, had been struck by the moving vehicle and stopped recording just before the end. Even so, the data they did capture, combined with video, wreckage study, and tests, told a clear story. Investigators found that the armored vehicles had not been restrained according to safe limits. The company's cargo manuals did not include all the required information from the aircraft manufacturer and from the maker of the cargo handling system. Some of the methods described for securing special loads were incorrect. The loadmaster did not have accurate guidance to calculate how many straps and which attachment points were needed for such heavy equipment. When the airplane rotated and the nose started to come up, the strain on the straps exceeded what they could safely carry. Once one vehicle broke free, the entire system of restraints began to fail. The final report named the inadequate cargo procedures as the main cause of the accident and criticized the airline's training for loadmasters and special cargo, as well as the oversight by regulators of these operations. In simple terms, the systems on paper that were supposed to keep heavy cargo in place were not strong enough, not clear enough, and not checked closely enough. Flydubai Flight 981 was a night flight that should have been simple. On March 19, 2016, a Boeing 737 left Dubai for the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don with 62 people on board, 55 passengers and 7 crew. It was a low-cost carrier flight, full of tourists and people heading home on a late-night arrival. The aircraft had enough fuel for about 8.5 hours of flying. The actual flight would take around 4 to 5 hours. On paper, there was plenty of margin. When the jet approached Rostov-on-Don the first time, the weather was already bad. Cloud was low, rain showers were passing over the airport, and the wind was strong and gusty from the southwest. There was turbulence and reported wind shear on final approach. Visibility was not terrible, but conditions were changing quickly along the path to the runway. The crew tried an initial approach to runway 22. As they came down through the clouds toward the runway, the flight's onboard system issued a wind shear warning. That is a serious alert. It tells the pilots that the wind around them is changing in a way that can suddenly rob the wings of lift or cause a dangerous change in speed and descent rate. The correct response is to abandon the landing and climb away. That is exactly what they did. They pushed the power up, climbed, and broke off the approach. Instead of diverting immediately to another airport, the crew entered a holding pattern near Rostov. They circled in the dark sky, waiting for the weather to improve. Down below, another flight from Aeroflot tried 3 times to land at the same airport and failed each time before finally diverting to a nearby city. Flydubai 981 kept holding. In total, they stayed in the area for nearly 2 hours, burning fuel and watching the reports. Sometime after 3 in the morning local time, the crew decided to try again. Fatigue was almost certainly a factor by then. They had been on duty for many hours. It was the middle of the night, and they had already flown 1 full approach and a long hold. But the airport was open, and they still had fuel to land and, if necessary, divert. They set up for another approach to the same runway. On the second attempt, the conditions were still rough. The wind at low level was reported around 25 to 35 knots from about 230 degrees. almost a strong crosswind with a tailwind component on parts of the flight path. There was severe turbulence on final. As the jet came down toward the runway, the airspeed suddenly jumped up by more than 20 knots, a sign of strong wind shear again. The pilots decided once more to go around. At first, the go-around looked normal. The thrust levers went forward, the engines spooled up, and the aircraft began to climb. The pilots retracted the landing gear and started to bring the flaps in, just as they would for a standard missed approach. The nose pitched up as the jet climbed into the clouds over the runway. From the ground, the airplane disappeared into the dark, low ceiling. What happened next took less than a minute and was later described in the final report as a loss of control linked to spatial disorientation. In simple terms, the captain's senses and the instruments stopped matching in his mind, and his control inputs turned a safe climb into a fatal dive. As the aircraft climbed through about 1,000 meters, the nose was higher than usual, and the speed was changing quickly in turbulence. The captain, who was flying, was pushing forward on the control column to stop the pitch-up. At the same time, he pressed the trim switch that moves the tailplane. Holding that switch nose down for several seconds, gradually trimmed the horizontal stabilizer into a strong nose-down position. Data from the flight recorder later showed that the stabilizer moved from a nose-up setting to a nose-down setting over about 12 seconds while the crew were still climbing. With the engines at high thrust and the aircraft in cloud, the motion cues were confusing. In this kind of situation, a pilot can feel as if the aircraft is pitching up even when it is not, or feel that it is diving when it is actually climbing. The only safe guide is the attitude indicator and the other instruments. The investigation concluded that the captain likely experienced a powerful illusion and believed he needed to push more to stop an excessive nose-up attitude. Then something changed very suddenly. When the captain eased off the forward pressure on the control column, the stabilizer, now trimmed far nose down, took over. The aircraft's nose dropped aggressively. The Boeing rolled slightly and pitched into a steep dive, with the nose pointed down at an angle of around 40 to 50 degrees, and the vertical acceleration dropping toward negative values. In the cockpit, everything would have felt weightless for a moment as the aircraft began to fall. Both pilots pulled back hard, trying to recover, but there was almost no altitude left. The jet accelerated rapidly, reaching an impact speed of roughly 600 kilometers per hour. It broke out of the cloud for the last seconds of its flight, but by then it was already pointed at the ground. Security cameras around the airport recorded the final moment. In one clip, you can see the runway lights in the distance as a bright, fast-moving shape drops out of the low cloud at a sharp angle. The aircraft disappears behind the horizon line near the runway, and a fraction of a second later, a massive flash fills the frame. A fireball erupts, lighting up the night and throwing sparks and debris into the darkness. Those few seconds of video are the night dive at Rostov that people around the world later watched in disbelief. The Boeing 737 hit the ground near the threshold of runway 22 and broke apart instantly. The force of the impact and the fuel on board produced a huge explosion and fire. Rescue teams at the airport responded quickly, but there was nothing they could do for the people on board. All 62 passengers and crew died in the crash. No one on the ground was injured. Investigators from the Russian Interstate Aviation Committee, together with experts from the United Arab Emirates, the United States, and other countries, spent years analyzing the data. The final report pointed to several linked factors. The key cause was the captain's loss of situational awareness and spatial orientation during a go-around at night in poor weather, combined with the long nose-down trim input that set the aircraft into a dive from which there was no time to recover. Contributing factors included strong wind and turbulence, the stress and fatigue of a long duty period, and the pressure of trying to land after almost 2 hours of holding instead of diverting earlier. Aeroflot Flight 1492 was a short domestic hop that turned into one of the most disturbing fire videos in modern aviation. On 5th of May 2019, a Sukhoi Superjet 100 took off from Moscow Sheremetyevo, heading for Murmansk in northern Russia. On board were 78 people, 73 passengers, and 5 crew. It was early evening, with thunderstorms in the area around Moscow, but nothing that would normally stop a routine departure. The jet lined up on the runway and took off toward the north. As it climbed through about 8,900 feet, it flew into an area of active thunderclouds and was struck by lightning. Almost at once, The crew lost the main radio and the autopilot. The flight control computers switched into a simplified backup mode called direct law, where the pilot's side stick movements control the control surfaces more directly, with far less automatic smoothing or protection. The cockpit suddenly became much busier. The captain declared an emergency and told controllers they needed to come back. With most of their normal radio link gone, they used a secondary channel and emergency transponder codes to signal that they had both communication problems and an emergency. The airplane was still flying. Both engines were working, but the crew were now hand-flying a jet in stormy air at high weight, in a degraded control mode many pilots see only briefly in simulators. The safest option from that point was a careful, textbook return. Slow the situation down, run checklists, calculate landing speed for their heavy weight, and fly a very stable approach, accepting that the landing would be overweight but survivable if done correctly. Instead, stress, weather, and the unfamiliar control mode began to eat away at that ideal picture. As the superjet turned back toward Sheremetyevo, the storm cells were still near the airport. Winds at low altitude were gusty, with crosswind and possible wind shear along the approach path. The aircraft was overweight because there was no system on this type that allowed the crew to dump fuel quickly. They would have to land heavier than the normal landing weight, something the structure could tolerate once if the touchdown was firm but controlled. On final approach, several small but important things went wrong. The crew did not carry out a full approach briefing. They did not properly set all the reference altitudes and go-around settings. The speed and descent path wandered above and below the ideal line. At times they were too fast, then pulled off too much thrust and sank back. The side stick inputs from the captain were abrupt and large, a sign that he was struggling with the more sensitive handling in direct law. In the cabin, passengers could feel the airplane rocking and bumping in the turbulence as it came down toward the runway. The first touchdown was already very hard. The jet hit the runway at a high speed, with a vertical force of more than 2 times its weight. Instead of staying on the ground, it bounced back into the air, climbing to several meters above the runway. In that moment, the crew still had a chance to make a controlled go-around, push the power up, stabilize the pitch, and go back into the pattern for another try. What happened instead made everything worse. During or just after the bounce, the thrust levers were pushed forward toward takeoff power, but the reverse thrust doors on the engines had already started to open. The system would not allow full forward power while the reversers were in transit, so the engines did not give the strong push the pilots were expecting. At the same time, the captain pulled the side stick fully back, trying to keep the airplane from sinking again.
The second hit was even worse. Gravity crushed the aircraft against the ground, forcing it to bounce back up. The structure couldn't take much more. The wings and wheels were being hit over and over, pushed way past their limits.
On the third impact, at around 140 knots, the landing gear finally collapsed. The struts punched up through the wing, ripping open the fuel tanks. Fuel sprayed out and ignited almost at once, fed by sparks and hot metal scraping along the runway. In videos shot from the terminal and from the ground near the runway, you can see the moment the airplane slams down, showers the runway with sparks, and then trails a growing sheet of flame as it skids down the concrete. The superjet slid for hundreds of meters, veered off the paved surface, and came to a stop on the grass, nose pointed roughly into the wind. By then, the fire had engulfed the wings and the entire rear section of the fuselage. Thick black smoke poured from the tail. The heat was intense enough to deform metal and melt windows in the aft cabin. Inside, the situation was almost unimaginable. The rear of the cabin filled quickly with smoke and flames from the burning fuel under the wings. Passengers in the last rows had almost no time to react. Many never managed to release their seatbelts. Those who did tried to move forward, away from the fire. Some collapsed in the aisle as the toxic smoke spread. In the front part of the cabin, the air was still barely breathable for a short window of time. People could see orange light and thick smoke through the back. The cabin crew at the front had little information from the cockpit. They looked outside, saw fire near the wings, and decided they had to start evacuation. The front left and front right doors were opened and slides deployed. Videos shot from the ground show people pouring out of those 2 exits, some of them carrying hand luggage, while the rear half of the airplane burns fiercely behind them. The back doors could not be used because of the fire. Firefighters reached the scene quickly, but the blaze at the tail was already fully developed. It took around 45 minutes to fully put out the fire. By that time, the rear cabin had been destroyed. Out of the 78 people on board, 41 died, including one member of the cabin crew. Most of those who survived were seated toward the front of the aircraft and managed to escape through the forward doors in the first minute or two, after the airplane came to a stop. Later, analysis by the investigating committee found no single catastrophic mechanical failure that doomed the flight after the lightning strike. The aircraft suffered an electrical failure that forced a return in difficult conditions and a difficult control mode. From there, the outcome was shaped mainly by human factors: incomplete use of checklists, unstable approach, rough handling of the controls, and a series of very hard landings that exceeded what the landing gear and wings could take. Once the gear punched through the wing and the fuel ignited, the fire spread so fast that many passengers in the back did not have a realistic chance to escape. Air Niugini Flight 73 was supposed to be a simple island hop. On 28 September 2018, a Boeing 737 was flying from Pohnpei to Port Moresby, with a planned stop at Chuuk International Airport in the Federated States of Micronesia. There were 47 people on board, 35 passengers, and 12 crew. As the airplane approached Chuuk, the crew were setting up for a routine landing on runway 04 over the shallow blue waters of Chuuk Lagoon. The weather was not perfect. There were rain showers and thunderstorms in the area, with reduced visibility and low clouds along the approach path. But conditions were still within limits for an instrument approach. The crew briefed the arrival only partially. They did not complete all of the company's approach and pre-landing checklists, and their briefing for this particular approach was incomplete. That meant that when conditions began to deviate from ideal, they did not have a clear, shared plan in their heads. As the 737 descended toward Chuuk, the autopilot followed the programmed path. The airplane was using radio guidance, and the pilots could also see a row of lights next to the runway called the Precision Approach Path Indicator, which shows whether you are high or low. Shortly before they entered the clouds on final, those lights were already showing that the airplane was low. Instead of the correct mix of red and white, they were seeing mostly white, a sign that they were not on the proper, shallow glide path. At about 1,000 feet above the water, the captain disconnected the autopilot and continued by hand. From that point on, things began to drift. The rate of descent grew higher than 1,000 feet per minute, a warning sign for any approach close to the ground. The flight path sank below the correct line, and then climbed back above it, creating a steeper than normal glide. In the clouds and rain, the pilot's picture of where they were in space became less and less accurate. Inside the cockpit, an important safety system was trying to help. The enhanced ground proximity warning system began calling out sink rate and glide slope again and again. In total, it issued 13 separate oral alerts during the final approach. The primary flight display even showed a visual pull-up warning. Each of these messages meant the same thing. The approach was unstable and should be abandoned immediately. The crew heard them but did not act. They did not call a go-around. They kept descending. From the passenger's point of view, there was nothing obviously wrong. Through the small windows, some could see only rain and cloud. Others saw glimpses of water. The engines sounded normal. The flaps were out, and the cabin was in standard landing mode. A passenger in the jump seat behind the pilots, an engineer, was even filming the approach on his phone for personal use. That video would later become a crucial piece of evidence. At 10:10 local time, the airplane reached sea level without ever reaching the concrete. It hit the surface of Chuuk Lagoon about 135 to 140 meters short of the runway threshold. To the people inside, it felt like a sudden, violent ditching. The nose pitched up slightly as the main fuselage slammed into the water. Windows shattered, panels broke, and water began to rush in. The 737 skipped once, then came down again and came to rest with its nose and part of the fuselage above water, and its tail and rear cabin partially submerged. In the cabin, the impact threw unrestrained passengers forward. Overhead bins burst open, and bags and loose objects flew through the air. Some rows near a break in the fuselage twisted or shifted. Lights went out and water surged up around the feet of people in the back. Yet the airplane did not immediately sink. There was a narrow window of time in which escape was possible. The cabin crew shouted commands and began an evacuation. Doors were opened where possible, and slides or overwing exits were used as floating platforms. Many of the passengers did not fully understand the word evacuate in English, and some hesitated or tried to take their luggage with them, slowing the flow of people trying to get out. Meanwhile, local fishermen and boat owners in small skiffs raced toward the half-submerged jet as soon as they saw the splash. Footage taken from nearby boats and from the shore shows a surreal scene. A modern 737 sitting in calm, bright blue water just offshore, with passengers standing on the wings and sliding down into the lagoon, life jackets on, as small boats crowd around to pick them up. United States Navy personnel from a nearby facility also joined the rescue, helping to pull people from the water and carry them to land. Initial reports said that everyone had survived. In the confusion, crew members believed they had seen all passengers leave the airplane. Later, when one person could not be located, divers were sent back into the wreckage. On the 1st of October, they found the body of a male passenger inside the fuselage, trapped between partially submerged rows 22 and 23. An autopsy showed that he had not been wearing his seatbelt and had died from head and facial injuries within about 3 minutes of the impact. Out of 47 people on board, 46 survived, and 6 were seriously injured. The final accident report left little doubt about the cause. The flight crew did not follow Air Niugini's standard operating procedures. They did not properly brief the approach, did not complete their checklists, allowed the airplane to descend on a steep, unstable path, and ignored repeated automated warnings that they were sinking too fast and flying a dangerous glide angle. In simple terms, they lost situational awareness and pressed on with a bad approach instead of going around. The safety investigation also criticized the airline's regulator for weak oversight and highlighted how confusion and language barriers complicated the evacuation. For viewers, Air Niugini Flight 73 is the Lagoon Crash, a jet that should have touched down on a short island runway, but ends up floating in bright tropical water, with passengers wading, swimming, and climbing into small boats. For pilots and investigators, it is a stark reminder that even in daylight, even with solid instruments and a working airplane, an unstabilized approach and a string of ignored pull-up warnings can turn a runway into a lagoon in just a few seconds. Most plane crashes are invisible. We only see the wreckage, the wreck reports, and a few photos taken long after the fire is out. In this video, we walked through 10 moments that were different. Here, the camera was already rolling, a driver on a bridge, a phone at a window, a security camera on the edge of a runway. They all caught the few seconds when a normal flight turned into something no one on board would ever forget. These clips are hard to watch, but they changed aviation. Investigators slowed them down frame by frame. They matched every flash, every sudden roll, every burst of fire to the data from the recorders. Those same images are now used in classrooms and simulators. They help new crews understand what a real stall over a city looks like, how fast a runway fire can grow, and how quickly panic can spread inside a dark, smoke-filled cabin. If you watch this far, you are part of a small group of people who want to understand what really happens in the sky, not just the headlines. If you want more detailed, careful documentaries like this, you can support the work by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who cares about aviation. Thank you for watching, and stay safe until we meet again in the next story.